The room smelled of burnt coffee and tension, and the junior officer felt a tremor run down his spine as he adjusted the strap of his uniform. He moved carefully across the polished floorboards that reflected the harsh overhead lights, and the shadow of his own legs seemed to follow him like a silent warning. The briefing had begun with murmurs and rustling papers, but now the room was quiet enough to hear the faint drip of a coffee machine somewhere in the corner. The Admiral sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid but his eyes scanning the documents before him as if he could see through the paper and into the minds of everyone present. The junior officer felt a mix of awe and fear because he knew this was not a room where mistakes were forgiven or overlooked. Every step toward the table felt heavier than the last, and the weight of the cup in his hands seemed to multiply with every second he had carried cups before delivered them without incident. But today it felt different. Today, there was a silence that was almost physical pressing down on him, as though the air itself was warning him to stop. He glanced at the officers seated around the table and noticed the subtle tension in their shoulders the way there. Hands clenched into fists or fiddled with pens. He felt their eyes on him, but when he tried to meet any of them, he found their gazes slipping away like fish avoiding the hook. He reached the table and paused, breathing in the sharp scent of paper and ink and the lingering smell of old coffee from yesterday. He placed the cup down gently at first, and then shifted it slightly as he aligned it with the edge of the polished surface. His hands shook a little, and he prayed silently that no one would notice. He could feel the slight warmth of the liquid through the thin ceramic, and for a moment he imagined it spilling and staining the carefully organized reports that lay before the Admiral. It was a foolish thought, but it made his stomach tighten as he fought the urge to step back and leave the room. The room felt colder than it had a moment ago. Or maybe it was just him and the sweat running down the back of his neck. The officers had stopped talking completely, and even the faint hum of the lights seemed louder than it should have been. Every small sound was amplified, the shuffle of papers, the scrape of a chair leg on the floor, and the soft but deliberate breathing of the person next to him. It was almost as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He took another step back but then froze because the Admiral had raised his eyes and looked directly at him, and in that look there was nothing angry or impatient, but something far more dangerous, the kind of awareness that could see mistakes before they happened. He stood there frozen, and the cup remained on the table, the steam curling slowly upward into the air like a ghost. He realized he could not move without drawing attention to himself. And yet standing there felt like the wrong choice too. Every second stretched longer than the last, and his mind began to race, imagining consequences that might never come. He could feel the pulse in his temples and the tightness in his chest as though the room itself had squeezed him into a corner and there was no escape. He could hear the faint click of a pen as one of the officers adjusted their grip and the soft rustle of papers being rearranged on the table. Each sound was magnified and seemed to echo in his ears like a warning drumbeat. He glanced at the Admiral again, and the man had returned to studying his documents. But the weight of that gaze lingered as if it was still watching him from across the table. The junior officer swallowed hard and tried to focus on the mundane task of setting the cup down properly, but even that felt monumental, as though the simple act of placing coffee on a table was now a mission fraught with danger. The room seemed to shrink around him, and he could feel his shoes sticking slightly to the floor from the previous day's cleaning solution. Every tiny detail became part of a larger pattern, the angle of the light hitting the cup, the position of the officer's hands, the way the Admiral's pen hovered over the page like a sword ready to strike all of it, combined into a weight that pressed down on him and made him wonder if this was what it felt like to be under a microscope or trapped in a dream from which there was no waking. He imagined what would happen if he spilled it. Even the tiniest drop would be noticed and whispered about later, and maybe worse, the conversation would pause, and all eyes would turn to him, and in that silence he would be exposed. He tried to calm himself, picturing the calm, steady movements he had practiced countless times in the mess hall, carrying trays of drinks. But this was different. This was the Admiral and the room and the silence and the weight of history pressing down like a living thing. He gripped the edge of the table and felt his knuckles turn white. The minutes stretched on, and his mind began to wander in small, sharp flashes, thinking about the path that led him here. The long days of training, the endless drills, the unspoken rules of respect and obedience, and the moments he had pushed himself to the edge of exhaustion, all leading to this one task of carrying a simple cup of coffee, and yet it felt like the most important thing in his life. He felt trapped between fear and duty, between wanting to flee and needing to stand firm, as if the very essence of his being had been distilled into that moment. And then he noticed something he had not. Before, the subtle tension in the room was not just from him, it was from the energy of the officers themselves. Each one seemed poised as if anticipating a signal, a shift, an event that none of them could yet name. Their bodies were coiled and ready. Their eyes flicked from him to the Admiral and back again like a silent communication. He realized then that the coffee was not the focus. It was the vessel, the symbol of all of them waiting for something unseen, something inevitable. He inhaled sharply, and the warmth of the cup seeped into his palms for a moment, grounding him and terrifying him all at once. The steam rose slowly, and he imagined it curling around the faces of the officers, as though it could carry messages or reveal secrets. He could not tell if his imagination was running wild, or if the tension truly made the air itself shimmer with expectation. His heart pounded, and he wondered if anyone else could hear it, or if it was his own private drumbeat marking the passing of time. He tried to move closer to the chair to take his place, but something held him back, the invisible force of the room pressing down, making each step a careful negotiation. He felt like he was walking a tightrope over an abyss that only he could see. Each micro-movement of his body was exaggerated. In his own perception, the slightest tremor, the smallest misstep could spell disaster. He was acutely aware of every sound, every scent, every flicker of movement around him. And still he kept going inch by inch toward the table, his senses straining, every fiber of his being alert to the minutest detail. The coffee cup sat on the polished wood like a beacon, the rich brown liquid dark and undisturbed, as if daring him to disturb it. He imagined what it would look like if it tipped the dark liquid. Spreading across the papers, the room erupting in gasps, the consequences cascading like dominoes. He closed his eyes for a second and felt the weight of all history of this room pressing down on him, the lives of those who had walked these halls. Before him, the decisions made, the lives affected the silent power of command. He opened his eyes and stepped closer, the surface of the table smooth under his fingertips and the cup trembling slightly as he adjusted it. He felt the heat radiating. From the liquid, a reminder that he was holding something alive in his hands. Something fragile and powerful at the same time. He knew he had to finish this task, and yet the room seemed endless, stretching in all directions, a trap designed to test his focus and resolve. He set the cup finally in the center of the papers as if offering a gift to the Admiral, and then stepped back, a small breath escaping his lungs. The coffee had spread slowly across the table, its dark liquid creeping toward the edge, as if it had a mind of its own. The officers around the table stiffened and exchanged glances, but no one spoke. The junior officer stood frozen, feeling the weight of their scrutiny as the warmth of the cup seeped through his fingers and into his nerves. He could feel the pull of the liquid like it was drawing attention to him and to the act he had just committed, the act that seemed so small, but now felt monumental. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, a steady, relentless drum that matched the rhythm of the tension in the room. Every eye was on him, though no one said a word. The sound of a pen clicking somewhere in the distance made him jump slightly, as if the smallest noise was amplified to a deafening roar. Tried to breathe evenly, but each inhalation seemed shallow and forced, and the smell of coffee mixed with the faint scent of ink and paper pressed down on him like a physical weight. The officers shifted in their chairs, their movements careful and deliberate, as if they were all aware of some invisible rule he could not yet understand. He felt their eyes flick from the spilled liquid to his hands, to the Admiral, who remained calm and unreadable, yet whose presence seemed to dominate the entire room. Each movement felt like a test, each glance a silent challenge. He wanted to move, but his body refused, as if the air itself had conspired to hold him in place. He remembered the countless hours of training drills, the relentless repetition of protocols and etiquette, and all the tiny ways they were taught to carry themselves in the presence of authority, and yet here all that training seemed insufficient. The coffee cup had become a symbol of everything that could go wrong in a single instant, and the pressure was unbearable. He could feel sweat running down his back, sticking his uniform to his skin as the minutes dragged on with excruciating slowness. The room seemed to shrink and expand at once, the walls pulsating with anticipation, and his senses heightened to an almost painful degree. He could feel the subtle vibrations of the table under his palms, the faint tick of a clock somewhere in the distance, the barely audible shuffle of feet on polished wood, and it all combined into a symphony of unease. The liquid on the table seemed to move in slow motion, spreading its dark tendrils over important documents, the symbols of strategy and decision-making. He imagined what it would mean if he had accidentally knocked the cup over, if the coffee had ruined a map, a report, or a secret message. He imagined the eyes of the Admiral narrowing the room, freezing in silence, the officers stiffening as though bracing for a reprimand or worse. He could feel the collective breath of the room held in anticipation of a signal, a movement, a word, and yet nothing came. The silence pressing down as if to test his very soul. He could feel the temperature in the room fluctuate with the tension, each second dragging into eternity as the officers remained poised waiting for an event. Only they seemed to anticipate. The junior officer felt trapped between fear and fascination, between the need to act and the impossibility of moving. Each movement of the coffee on the table became monumental, the spreading liquid almost alive. It mirrored his rising panic and the intensity of the atmosphere. He wanted to speak to explain himself, but the rules of decorum bound his tongue, and every word he imagined seemed inadequate or dangerous. He could feel a kind of rhythm to the room, the subtle shifting of weight, the brushing of sleeves across polished wood, the quiet exhale of those around him, and it all seemed connected to the slow expansion of the coffee across the table. As if time itself had slowed to allow every second to be experienced fully. He imagined what the world would look like from above the table, from the eyes of the Admiral observing him from across the room, seeing his hesitation, his panic, and yet recognizing the duty that brought him here, the commitment that compelled him to stand even when frozen by fear. The officers adjusted their seating, and the soft scrape of chairs sounded impossibly loud in the tense atmosphere. Each small noise carried weight. The shuffle of papers, the scratch of a pen, and the faint hum of ventilation seemed orchestrated to test the junior officer. His palms were clammy. He tried to wipe them discreetly on his uniform. But the movement made him more aware of himself and of the liquid spreading imperceptibly over the documents below. The slow advance of coffee seemed to mock him, the impossibility of retreating adding to the gravity of the moment. He realized that the liquid had crossed a boundary, a line drawn not by himself, but by circumstance, and that every second now amplified the stakes. The tension of the room was palpable, a living presence pressing on his shoulders, on his back, on his chest. He could almost feel it in his lungs as he struggled to maintain composure. the discipline drilled into him during long nights and relentless practice, now standing between him and disaster. The officer's eyes moved subtly, communicating in a silent language. He could not read their subtle nods and slight shifts, seeming to signal some kind of readiness or anticipation. He could sense a storm building not in the weather, but in the room, in the collective awareness of those present, and the coffee at the center of it all had become an unwilling participant and a catalyst and a warning all at once. He felt the hum of electricity through the air, as if a spark could ignite the entire scenario, and he would be the one to trigger it. He began to notice small details he had not before: the faint discoloration of the table under previous spills, the slight warp in the polished wood, the echo of shoes moving quietly across the floor. The officer's hands rested lightly on the papers, as if to brace for impact, or to halt it, and the movement of the coffee became almost a heartbeat in itself, synchronized with his own rapid pulse. He imagined the path the liquid could take, each spread like a story of potential calamity, and yet the room remained, frozen in time. The junior officer found himself analyzing every possible outcome, every single motion and every micro-decision that could lead to disaster or salvation. He felt a strange sense of clarity mixed with terror. The coffee was more than a drink, more than a mistake. It was a symbol of consequence, the fragile boundary between control and chaos, and he was standing in the center of it like a sentinel or a fool, depending on the perspective of the unseen observer. The minutes stretched, and the tension compounded each second. Layering upon the previous, the room filled with invisible pressure, pushing on him from every direction. He could hear the soft intake of breaths and subtle movements of the others, each one magnified in significance. The subtle twitch of an eyebrow, the micro shift in posture, all communicating in a language he could not translate but felt viscerally. He understood instinctively that the room was testing him, testing his focus, his nerves, his capacity to withstand. The weight of expectation. He imagined the coffee moving further across the table, inching toward charts, maps, and photographs representing strategies, decisions, lives. He could see the ripple effect in his mind like a slow-motion cascade, and he shuddered at the power of such a small action to threaten the stability of everything in the room. He felt the pull of inevitability, the sense that something must happen, that the pause before the event carried its own significance, the tension a living entity that would not allow him to relax. He noticed the faint glint of light reflecting off the liquid, the way it caught the harsh overhead illumination and projected it in tiny lines across the polished table. He saw the shapes of the officers reflected in the table surface, distorted by the liquid, and felt as if he were watching the room from an impossible angle, like a god or a prisoner forced to observe the minute movements of ants. He could sense the collective waiting, the room holding its breath, the stillness, an unspoken agreement that this moment was critical. He felt his own heartbeat synchronize with the creeping advance of the coffee, every thump an echo in his skull, every second a weight in his chest. The floorboards seemed to vibrate with tension, the air thick with unspoken commands and expectations. He realized that every micro detail mattered: the tilt of his hand, the slight wobble of the cup, the tension in his fingers, the gaze of every officer present, and the unfathomable calm of the Admiral. Each factor contributing to an invisible equation of disaster or approval. The junior officer tried to steady his hands, imagining the drill of placing trays and cups in the mess hall in the past, trying to remember the feeling of confidence and normalcy, but even those memories felt distant, irrelevant, inadequate against the weight of the present. The coffee spread imperceptibly, inch by inch, yet with a significance that dwarfed time. He could feel the slow pressure of inevitability, the way the room seemed to lean toward the moment, the anticipation coiling tighter and tighter, as if the air itself was a spring ready to snap. He looked up briefly to gauge the Admiral, whose expression remained inscrutable calm, but somehow omnipotent. He felt the power radiating from that presence the way the room bent subtly to the will of this single figure. He understood in that instant that the coffee, the spill, the tension, and his frozen body were all a test, an initiation, into something greater, something that required focused composure and an awareness beyond ordinary understanding. He could feel the weight of this lesson pressing on him. The officers around him remained statuesque, eyes darting occasionally to each other for unspoken confirmation, their postures rigid, their presence commanding and silent. He felt the collective awareness of the room like a tide pressing against his chest, heaving him slightly with each heartbeat. The coffee spread ever so slowly, as though time had slowed to allow each droplet to be observed, analyzed, and judged. The silence was no longer empty. It was a tangible force shaping his perception, dictating the rhythm of his thoughts, the cadence of his breathing. He realized that, even as his mind raced and his body froze, he was becoming acutely aware of the power of presence, the weight of expectation, and the significance of observation. He understood that the room would never truly forgive a misstep, but it would also never demand a word of apology if the lesson was learned, if the presence was acknowledged, if the tension was respected. He felt himself standing at the threshold of understanding. Then the Admiral looked up, and the room seemed to contract around the junior officer, as if every wall and chair were pressing closer. He could feel the weight of 1,000 unspoken orders in the calm of that gaze. The officers froze mid-motion, their hands hovering over papers and pens as if suspended in time. The coffee cup trembled slightly on the edge of the table, but no drop fell. The silence was a living entity wrapping itself around him, pressing into his chest and throat. The Admiral spoke, his voice low and deliberate, carrying the full authority of command. He said the call sign, and the room immediately transformed as if a switch had been flipped. The spread of coffee paused mid-flow, the air itself seeming to hold its breath. Every officer's head snapped slightly toward the speaker, the tiny movements, magnified in his perception as though each was a ripple across a pond. He felt an almost electric current crawl up his spine, the weight of expectation and recognition combined in a single.